He chose Christmas to remind her she didn't belong. The tree in the corner of the living room glowed in soft gold, glass ornaments catching the light like tiny suns, the scent of pine and cinnamon drifting through a house that looked perfect from the outside. 17-year-old Emily Carter stood near the fireplace holding a stack of folded napkins, her sweater sleeves pulled over her hands, listening to relatives laugh over eggnog and football on the television, trying to calculate the safest distance between herself and Richard Coleman without making it obvious, because in that house survival had always meant shrinking quietly. He stood at the head of the dining table carving the turkey with slow, deliberate movements, performing for the room, his voice smooth when he told stories about hard work and discipline, his smile tight whenever Emily's name surfaced in conversation. When her aunt asked about college applications, Emily answered softly that she'd applied to a state school 300 miles away. Tuition manageable, dorms modest but clean, a campus she had only seen in brochures she kept hidden in her dresser drawer. The room shifted almost imperceptibly, like a draft passing through a closed window, and Richard's fork paused midair. He asked her to repeat it, louder this time, and when she did, careful and respectful, he laughed, not warmly but sharply, as if she had told a joke at the wrong moment. He reminded her, in front of everyone, that she didn't make decisions in his house without permission, that gratitude should come before ambition, that dreams cost money someone else had earned. The music from the speakers continued, silent night, faint and serene, while cousins pretended to scroll through their phones. Emily felt every pair of eyes slide toward her and then away. When she tried to explain that she had earned scholarships, that she planned to work part-time, that she didn't expect anything from him, his chair scraped against the hardwood with a sound too loud for the season, and his hand moved faster than her thoughts, a sharp motion that stopped her words mid-sentence and left the room suspended in stunned quiet. No one gasped, no one stood, her mother's lips parted but no sound came out. The lights on the tree kept blinking, red to gold to green, indifferent. Emily did not cry, she did not argue, she kept her chin level the way she had learned to do years ago when correction came dressed as character building. Heat bloomed across her cheek, but what burned deeper was the realization that humiliation could feel colder than winter. Richard adjusted his cufflinks as if restoring order, telling the room that respect had to be taught early, that children who forgot their place needed reminders. Someone coughed, someone reached for more gravy, the world resumed its motion. Emily set the napkins down with steady hands and walked to the hallway bathroom, closing the door gently, not slamming it, because she would not give him the satisfaction of drama. In the mirror beneath the yellow light, she studied her reflection, the faint outline on her skin, the tightness around her eyes, and something inside her shifted, not loud, not explosive, just a quiet alignment. She understood then that belonging was never going to be granted in that house. It would have to be built somewhere else, miles away, beyond the reach of a dining table where love was conditional and silence was safer than truth. When she stepped back into the living room, the presents were already being passed around, her name written in looping script on boxes that felt suddenly meaningless. She took her seat at the edge of the couch, posture straight, hands folded in her lap, and let the night continue without her voice, already measuring the distance between this house and the life she would someday claim. The next morning the house smelled like burnt coffee and artificial pine, as if the night before had tried to erase itself. Emily Carter woke before sunrise, the digital clock on her nightstand blinking 6:30 in pale blue numbers, and for a few seconds she listened to the quiet hum of the heating system pushing warm air through vents that never quite reached her small bedroom at the end of the hallway. Her cheek no longer stung, but something deeper had settled into place, a clarity that felt steadier than anger. She sat up slowly, feet touching the cold hardwood floor, and glanced at the brochure from Lakeview State University tucked beneath her pillow, the campus green stretching wide under an open sky, buildings made of red brick and promise. Downstairs, cabinet doors opened and closed with sharp precision, Richard already moving through the kitchen like a man who believed control could be restored with routine. Her mother's voice floated softly in response to his, agreeable, careful. Emily dressed in jeans and a gray sweater, pulling her hair back into a low ponytail, each movement deliberate, as if rehearsing for a future where every choice would be her own. When she entered the kitchen, Richard did not look at her at first. He read the newspaper, pages snapping as he turned them, the headline about the economy reflecting in his glasses. Her mother placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of Emily without meeting her eyes. No one mentioned the night before. The silence felt practiced, almost contractual. Emily thanked her mother, sat down and ate slowly, aware that this would be the last breakfast she would accept under this roof. After a few minutes, Richard folded the paper and cleared his throat, announcing that college talk was finished, that she would attend community college nearby if she went anywhere at all, that independence was earned through obedience. His tone was calm now, measured, as though reason itself stood behind him. Emily listened, hands resting in her lap, and for the first time she did not feel the urge to defend herself. She realized that explanations were invitations for debate, and debate was a game he always won because the rules were his. Instead she nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, and finished her orange juice. Later, in her bedroom, she opened her closet and pulled out an old suitcase with a broken zipper that stuck halfway and less. Guided gently, she laid it on the bed and began folding clothes with careful precision. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters, a winter coat, sneakers, the acceptance letter she had hidden inside a textbook. She counted the cash she had saved from babysitting and tutoring, crisp $20 bills tucked inside a small envelope, not much but enough for a bus ticket 300 miles north and a deposit on a dorm room. Outside her window the neighborhood looked ordinary. Frost clinging to lawns, a mail truck rolling past at 15 miles per hour, children riding new bicycles up and down the street. Everything appeared stable, predictable. Inside she felt the quiet unraveling of a life she had tried for years to fit into. By early afternoon she zipped the suitcase closed and carried it downstairs, the wheels bumping softly against each step. Her mother stood by the sink, hands submerged in soapy water, and turned at the sound. Their eyes met for a brief second, 1,000 unsaid sentences passing between them. Her mother whispered that she should wait, that things would calm down, that families survived worse. Emily stepped closer and kissed her mother's cheek, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender detergent, and told her she loved her. When Richard appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, he asked where she thought she was going with that bag. She answered simply that she had been accepted and classes started in 2 weeks. He reminded her that she did not have his permission. She replied, still calm, that she was not asking. The front door opened with a soft click, cold December air rushing in to meet her. She did not slam it behind her. She did not look back. She walked down the driveway, suitcase rolling over concrete, breath visible in the winter light, and as she reached the sidewalk she understood that leaving did not require shouting. Sometimes it required only movement, steady and forward, toward a horizon no one else could claim. The bus station smelled like diesel and burnt coffee, and Emily Carter stood beneath a flickering fluorescent light with her suitcase beside her, the strap of her backpack digging into her shoulder as if to remind her that leaving had weight. The digital board above the ticket counter flashed departures in red letters: Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, each city a possibility measured in miles and nerve. She bought a one-way ticket north using nearly half of the cash she had saved, sliding the crisp bills across the counter with steady fingers, and when the clerk handed her a thin paper ticket, it felt less like transportation and more like permission. The bus ride lasted 6 hours, long enough for doubt to whisper and long enough for resolve to answer. Outside the window the highway stretched flat and endless, gas stations and rest stops passing every 30 or 40 miles, fields dusted with frost under a pale winter sun. She did not text her mother. She did not check her phone. She watched her reflection in the glass overlay the landscape and tried to memorize the feeling of motion, because motion meant she was no longer standing still in someone else's shadow. When the bus finally pulled into the Lakeview terminal, the air was colder than she expected, the wind sharp against her face as she stepped down onto unfamiliar pavement. The campus sat 2 miles away, red brick buildings rising beyond a line of bare trees, the clock tower visible even from the road like a quiet promise. She walked the last stretch pulling her suitcase behind her, wheels rattling over cracked sidewalks, passing coffee shops and a bookstore with a display of winter novels in the window. Her dorm room was on the 3rd floor of an older building that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and heating pipes. The room itself was small, barely 12 feet by 12 feet, with a narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a window that looked out onto a courtyard dusted with snow. She set her suitcase on the mattress and stood in the center of the room, listening to the radiator click and hum, and for the first time since Christmas she allowed herself to exhale fully. There was no raised voice in the hallway, no rules taped invisibly to the walls, only space. The first weeks were not cinematic, they were practical. She attended orientation sessions in lecture halls that seated 200 students, wrote her name in black ink on sign-in sheets, and introduced herself with a calm smile. She applied for a job at a campus library shelving books for $9.50 an hour, working evening shifts that ended at 10. She learned the bus schedule to the grocery store 2 miles off campus and calculated every purchase, comparing the price of cereal per ounce and choosing generic brands without hesitation. At night she studied under the yellow glow of her desk lamp, textbooks open, highlighter in hand, her world shrinking to footnotes in case studies. Sometimes exhaustion pressed against her ribs, and sometimes she wondered if Richard had already replaced her absence with a new narrative about ungrateful youth. But those thoughts came and went like passing clouds. What remained was the rhythm she built for herself. Wake at 6, classes until 3, library shift, study until midnight, repeat. Weeks turned into months and winter gave way to a hesitant spring, patches of green appearing in the courtyard below her window. She joined a study group for introductory business law, speaking only when necessary but listening with precision. Professors began to recognize her, not because she was loud but because her assignments were thorough, margins filled with careful reasoning. When grades were posted at the end of the semester, her name appeared near the top of the list. She stared at the screen in the computer lab, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. It was not triumph, it was ownership. No one had granted this to her. No one had threatened it away. It existed because she had shown up every day and done the work. That night she stood by her dorm window watching students cross the courtyard below, their laughter drifting upward into the cool air. And she understood that distance was not only measured in miles, it was measured in growth. 300 miles away, a house still stood with its blinking lights and strict rules, but here in a 12 by 12 room with a desk and a radiator, Emily Carter began constructing a life that answered to no raised voice but her own steady resolve. By the time Emily Carter reached her junior year, the campus no longer felt borrowed. It felt earned. The red brick buildings that once seemed imposing now stood like familiar witnesses to her routine, and the 12 by 12 dorm room had been replaced by a modest off-campus apartment 6 blocks from Lakeview State University, a third-floor walk-up with creaking stairs and a view of Main Street where traffic moved steadily at 25 miles per hour. She paid $720 a month in rent, splitting utilities with a quiet nursing major named Hannah, and every bill was tracked in a small leather planner she carried in her bag. Numbers no longer intimidated her. They obeyed her calculations. She had declared a major in business administration with a concentration in finance, drawn to the logic of balance sheets and the quiet authority of contracts. During the day she attended lectures in halls that seated 150 students, taking notes with deliberate precision, and in the evening she worked 25 hours a week as a research assistant for Professor Daniel Whitaker, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a habit of tapping his pen when thinking. He noticed her not because she demanded attention, but because she anticipated problems before they surfaced. When case studies were assigned, she read beyond the required chapters, marking margins with questions about risk exposure and liability. Professor Whitaker once asked how she had developed such discipline, and she answered simply that structure made her feel steady. She did not explain that unpredictability had once lived at her dinner table. She saved every extra dollar, placing it into a high-yield savings account she had opened with an initial deposit of $100. By the end of her third year the account held over $8,000. It was not wealth, but it was independence measured in currency. She no longer checked her phone hoping for an apology that never came. Months passed without a call from home. Occasionally her mother sent a short message asking if she was eating well or staying warm. Emily responded kindly but briefly, keeping emotion out of the exchange. Distance had taught her that peace required boundaries. In her senior year she secured an internship at a mid-sized investment firm downtown. 40-minute bus ride each morning. She bought her first tailored blazer from a clearance rack for $89 and had the sleeves altered to fit. When she stepped into the firm's glass lobby on her first day, marble floors reflecting the ceiling lights above, she felt the old instinct to shrink rise in her chest. She countered it by standing straighter. During meetings she listened more than she spoke, absorbing the cadence of negotiations and the subtle shifts in tone that signaled leverage. She learned that power in business rarely shouted. It moved through clauses and signatures. One afternoon a senior analyst handed her a complex file and said most interns would struggle with it. She returned the next morning with a revised projection model that identified overlooked liabilities. The analyst stared at the spreadsheet for a long moment before nodding slowly. Respect, she discovered, could be built the way a portfolio was built, asset by asset. When graduation approached, she stood in line at the campus bookstore purchasing her cap and gown, the total coming to $142 after tax. She paid with her own debit card. On commencement day, the stadium filled with families waving banners and snapping photos. Emily sat among hundreds of graduates, the May sun warm against her shoulders, and when her name was called she walked across the stage with measured steps. There was no loud cheering from a familiar voice in the stands. There was only the steady applause of a crowd that did not know her history. As she accepted her diploma, she felt not vindication but alignment. She had built something that did not depend on permission. Later that evening she returned to her apartment, diploma tube resting on the kitchen table, and opened her laptop to review a formal job offer from the investment firm. The salary listed $58,000 per year with benefits. She read the number twice, not to admire it, but to confirm it. Outside, traffic continued along Main Street, headlights passing in quiet rhythm. Inside, Emily Carter understood that the girl who once stood under blinking Christmas lights had been replaced by a woman who understood value, both in markets and in herself. The first year at the investment firm did not transform Emily Carter overnight. It refined her. Her office sat on the 12th floor of a glass building downtown, the windows stretching from waist height to the ceiling and overlooking a grid of streets where cars idled at red lights and pedestrians crossed in disciplined lines. She arrived every morning at 8:30 sharp, coffee in hand, heels measured against polished marble floors, greeting the receptionist with a calm nod. $58,000 a year meant she could move into a one-bedroom apartment closer to the river, 980 square feet with exposed brick and a small balcony that caught the late afternoon sun. She signed the lease herself, initialing each page of the contract with steady handwriting, reading every clause before committing. The firm assigned her to portfolio analysis, long hours reviewing risk assessments, retirement accounts, and investment strategies for clients whose net worth exceeded $10 million. She learned how wealth protected itself, how it multiplied quietly, how it required patience more than noise. Senior partners began inviting her into meetings not because she demanded entry but because her reports were precise, her projections conservative yet sharp. When she spoke, it was brief and supported by data. When she remained silent, it was intentional. By her second year she received a raise to $72,000 and a performance bonus that she invested rather than celebrated. Her savings account grew. Her student loans shrank. She replaced her clearance rack blazer with 2 tailored suits. Purchased after careful comparison, navy and charcoal, both fitted to her exact measurements. Nothing about her was extravagant. Everything about her was deliberate. Outside of work she built a routine that mirrored her professional discipline. She ran 3 miles along the river trail on Saturday mornings, headphones low enough to hear the rhythm of her own breath. She cooked simple meals in her small kitchen, salmon baked at 400 degrees, brown rice measured precisely, vegetables seasoned lightly. She did not fill her apartment with clutter. The space remained open, intentional, free of raised voices. Occasionally colleagues invited her to happy hour gatherings, and she attended sometimes, standing near the edge of conversations, observing the way confidence moved through a room. It was during one of those evenings that she first noticed Jonathan Hayes, a senior associate recently transferred from the firm's Chicago office. He was not the loudest voice at the table. He listened more than he interrupted. When discussions drifted toward market volatility, he asked questions that revealed strategy rather than ego. Emily noticed the absence of performance in him. Weeks later they were assigned to collaborate on a complex account involving a family-owned manufacturing company valued at $50 million. Long hours in conference rooms followed, spreadsheets projected onto walls, coffee cups stacking near laptops. Jonathan treated her as an equal from the first meeting, crediting her insights without hesitation. When she suggested restructuring a segment of the portfolio to reduce exposure by 12%, he supported the recommendation with calm confidence. Respect between them grew not through dramatic gestures but through competence. Outside the office their conversations extended to quiet dinners at modest restaurants, conversations about books, about long-term goals, about the meaning of stability. He asked about her family once, gently, and she answered in measured sentences, revealing enough to be honest but not enough to reopen wounds. He did not press. He simply nodded, understanding that silence can hold history. By her third year at the firm she earned a promotion to associate, her salary crossing into 6 figures for the first time. She transferred 10% of every paycheck directly into investments, building a portfolio that reflected her own belief in steady growth. One evening she stood on her balcony overlooking the river, city lights reflecting off dark water, and considered how far she had traveled since that December morning when She rolled a suitcase down a driveway. She did not feel the urge to announce her progress to anyone. She did not scroll through old messages or search for validation. The power shift had not arrived with applause. It had arrived quietly in direct deposits, in signed contracts, in the calm way she carried herself through rooms that once would have intimidated her. She had built a life measured not in reaction but in intention, and for the first time she sensed that the distance between her past and her present was no longer fragile. It was structural, reinforced by every disciplined choice she made. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, just as the city outside Emily Carter's office window began dressing itself in holiday lights. She had stayed late to finalize a quarterly performance report, the numbers aligning cleanly across her screen, when her personal phone vibrated against the polished surface of her desk. She glanced at it without urgency, expecting a calendar reminder or a message from Jonathan, but the name that illuminated the screen stilled her hand midair. Richard Coleman. The letters sat there in plain white font, unembellished, as if they carried no history. For a moment she let the phone continue vibrating until it stopped. Then it began again. She did not feel panic. She felt something colder and more composed, the same clarity that had guided her years earlier. She silenced the office lights around her, gathered her coat, and stepped into the hallway before answering. The corridor was empty, the sound of her heels echoing softly against the marble floor. She pressed accept and lifted the phone to her ear without speaking. His voice arrived different from memory, lower, thinner around the edges. He asked how she had been, whether she was still in the city, whether she had a few minutes to talk. She noticed the absence of command in his tone. It sounded measured, almost cautious. She answered that she was well and asked what he needed. The question settled between them like a contract waiting to be signed. He cleared his throat and explained that the small construction business he had managed for years had struggled. Projects had fallen through. Partners had withdrawn. There were legal complications he did not fully understand. He said he had heard through a distant relative that she worked in finance. Now that she might know how to advise him. He did not mention Christmas. He did not mention the driveway or the suitcase. He spoke in practical terms, as if years of silence could be bridged by shared vocabulary. Emily leaned against the cool wall of the hallway, watching her reflection faintly in the glass of a nearby conference room. She asked for details, her voice steady, requesting figures, timelines, documents. He hesitated before admitting that debt had accumulated, that creditors were pressing, that he feared losing the house. She pictured the blinking lights, the narrow hallway, the kitchen table where rules had once been declared. She did not respond emotionally. She asked whether he had consulted an attorney. He said he could not afford one. The irony did not need commentary. She told him she would need to review formal paperwork before offering any opinion and that advice required clarity. He grew quiet at that, perhaps unaccustomed to being guided by the girl who once stood small before him. He asked if they could meet in person. She considered her calendar for the week, the client meetings, the investment reviews, the dinner plans with Jonathan. She selected a time that did not disrupt her priorities and suggested a public place near her office, a cafe on Main Street where conversations remained civil under soft lighting. He agreed quickly, gratitude flickering through his voice. Before ending the call he said he was proud of her success. The words felt rehearsed, uncertain. She acknowledged them with a brief thank you and ended the call without prolonging it. The hallway returned to silence. She stood there for a few seconds longer, measuring her breathing. When she stepped back into her office she did not appear shaken. She gathered her files, placed her phone inside her bag, and turned off her desk lamp. Outside, snow had begun falling lightly, dusting the sidewalks below. As she rode the elevator down 12 floors, she watched the numbers descend in calm sequence. The past had reached for her, but it no longer towered over her. It arrived asking, and for the first time she would decide the terms of the conversation. The cafe on Main Street smelled of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon syrup. The kind of place where conversations stayed measured beneath soft jazz, and the steady hiss of the espresso machine. Emily Carter arrived 10 minutes early, as she always did, choosing a small round table near the window where she could see the sidewalk and the slow drift of December snow. She wore her navy coat over a charcoal suit, hair neatly secured, posture straight but unforced. Her phone rested face down beside a leather portfolio that contained a legal pad and a pen aligned perfectly along its edge. When Richard Coleman stepped inside, he paused briefly as his eyes adjusted to the warm lighting. He looked older than she remembered, shoulders slightly rounded, hair more gray than brown. the confidence that once filled doorways now contained within careful movements. He spotted her and approached with a restrained smile, removing his gloves as he sat across from her. For a moment neither of them spoke. The cafe's holiday garland twinkled above the counter, a subtle reminder of the season that had once defined their fracture. She began by asking for the documents. He slid a manila envelope across the table, fingers lingering on its edge before letting go. Inside were bank statements, loan agreements, letters from creditors printed in bold type. She reviewed them quietly, turning each page with steady precision, the faint scratch of paper against paper louder than any accusation. He watched her as if searching for judgment in her expression. She offered none. Instead she asked structured questions, requesting clarification on dates, interest rates, outstanding balances. Her tone remained professional, neither distant nor intimate. He explained that 2 projects had collapsed after suppliers withdrew, that he had signed personal guarantees on equipment leases, that penalties accumulated faster than revenue. She calculated figures mentally while noting them on the legal pad, drawing small lines that connected liabilities to potential restructuring paths. After several minutes she looked up and spoke in measured cadence, outlining options: negotiation with creditors, consolidation of debt, consultation with a bankruptcy attorney to assess Chapter 11 protections. He shifted in his seat at the word bankruptcy, discomfort visible but restrained. She continued calmly, explaining that avoidance would only narrow his choices. The authority in her voice did not rise, it settled. He asked whether she could loan him money, a bridge until matters stabilized. The request hovered between them, simple yet heavy. She folded her hands on the table before responding. She told him that personal loans within families often blurred boundaries and that she had learned the value of clear agreements. If she were to consider any financial involvement, it would require formal contracts, collateral, and legal oversight. Nothing would be informal. Nothing would rely on assumption. He absorbed her words slowly, perhaps recognizing the reversal not in volume but in structure. This was no longer a conversation dictated by household hierarchy. It was an evaluation governed by policy and prudence. He attempted a faint smile, mentioning that he had always known she would succeed. She acknowledged the statement without embracing it, returning to the documents and highlighting a line that revealed a high-interest clause he had overlooked. She suggested immediate consultation with a specialist and offered to connect him with a reputable attorney she trusted, making clear that her role would be advisory, not emotional. When the waitress arrived with 2 cups of black coffee, steam rising between them, Emily wrapped her hands around the ceramic mug but did not drink. She maintained eye contact as she summarized her assessment, her voice steady, composed, impossible to dismiss. Richard nodded more than he spoke, the shift in dynamic subtle yet undeniable. Outside the window pedestrians passed bundled in scarves and coats, unaware that inside a quiet recalibration was taking place. When the meeting concluded, she stood first, placing a business card on the table with the attorney's name printed in clean font. She told him to email scanned copies of any additional documents and that clarity would determine next steps. He rose as well, slower, thanking her with a tone that carried more humility than authority. She did not extend the meeting beyond its purpose. She wished him well in measured words and stepped back onto Main Street, cold air brushing her face. As she walked toward her office building, heels steady against the sidewalk, she felt no surge of triumph, only alignment. The power had not shifted through confrontation. It had shifted through composure, and she carried it the way she carried everything now, balanced, intentional, entirely her own. Snow continued falling through the week, thin layers settling along Main Street and softening the city's edges, and Emily Carter returned to her routines without visible disruption. She reviewed client portfolios in the mornings, attended strategy meetings in the afternoons, and in the evening she answered emails from Richard Coleman that arrived in careful, almost formal language. He sent scanned documents as requested, bank statements dated over the past 18 months, notices marked urgent, contracts he admitted he had signed without reading thoroughly. She responded with concise observations, highlighting risks and outlining procedural steps, always maintaining professional distance. There were no emotional undertones in her messages, no references to the past, only structure and clarity. One afternoon he requested another meeting, this time at her office building, explaining that he had met with the attorney. She recommended and needed further guidance before making final decisions. She scheduled him for Friday at 4:30, the last slot of her day. When he arrived at the lobby, the security desk required identification and logged his name into the visitor system. He waited beneath a chandelier that reflected across polished stone floors, glancing upward at the 12 stories of glass and steel. She met him at the elevator, badge clipped neatly to her blazer, and pressed the button without unnecessary words. Inside the conference room overlooking the river, she laid out printed summaries of his financial position. The numbers were direct and unemotional, losses measured in thousands, obligations extending months ahead. He sat across from her, hands clasped together, absorbing the reality that could no longer be avoided. She explained that restructuring would require asset liquidation, potential sale of equipment, and transparent communication with lenders. Pride would not stabilize a balance sheet, action would. He listened more than he spoke, occasionally nodding, occasionally rubbing his temples as if the data carried physical weight. At one point he asked quietly whether she ever regretted leaving. The question entered the room without warning. She paused only briefly before answering. She told him that leaving had been necessary. She did not elaborate. Necessity required no embellishment. Silence followed, not hostile, simply factual. He then revealed something she had not anticipated. The house was already listed for sale. Market value had dropped compared to years before. He said he understood if she did not want to be involved beyond advice. She noticed the absence of defensiveness in his tone. There was no attempt to reclaim authority, no insistence on gratitude, only acknowledgement. She folded her hands on the table and told him that any further assistance would follow professional standards. She would not co-sign loans, she would not merge personal finances. However, if he complied fully with legal recommendations, she would consider investing in a structured recovery plan under documented terms. Everything would be written, everything would be transparent. He agreed without protest. As the meeting concluded, she escorted him back to the elevator. The glass doors closed between them with a quiet mechanical hum. She watched the numbers descend until the car disappeared from view. Standing alone in the hallway, she felt neither resentment nor relief. She felt equilibrium. That evening Jonathan met her for dinner at a small restaurant near the river, candles glowing softly on each table. He noticed the thoughtful quiet in her demeanor and asked whether the meeting had gone well. She told him it had been productive. He reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his, not to rescue but to steady. She allowed the gesture, understanding that partnership did not require surrender. Outside, the city lights reflected on dark water, steady and unshaken. Inside, Emily recognized that the true shift had already occurred. The man who once governed a household through volume now sat in waiting rooms and conference rooms asking for guidance. She did not celebrate the reversal. She simply carried herself through it with the same discipline that had built her independence. When she returned home that night, she stood on her balcony watching snow gather along the railing, the air crisp and quiet. Years earlier she had walked away with a single suitcase and a thin envelope of savings. Now she held leverage measured not only in dollars but in composure. And as winter deepened around the city, she understood that control did not announce itself. It revealed itself in moments when the past arrived asking and she responded without raising her voice. By the time Christmas approached again, nearly a decade had passed since the night that fractured a household, and the city shimmered beneath strands of white lights draped across storefronts and balconies. Emily Carter stood in her office reviewing final paperwork for Richard Coleman's restructuring plan, the agreement now formalized through attorneys and secured under strict contractual terms. Assets had been liquidated, debts renegotiated, and the house on the market for months had finally sold at a reduced but stabilizing price. She had chosen to invest a calculated portion of her capital into the recovery plan, not as a rescue, but as a structured financial decision backed by collateral and legal protection. Every signature had been witnessed, every clause had been reviewed twice. When Richard arrived for the final meeting of the year, he no longer carried the posture of a man expecting authority. He carried a folder neatly organized, documents tabbed and labeled. He thanked her before sitting down, his tone steady and unguarded. She outlined the repayment schedule, the performance milestones required for continued support, and the consequences should terms be violated. There was no tension in her voice, only clarity. He listened carefully, asking precise questions, no longer interrupting. When the meeting concluded, he hesitated, then spoke quietly. He said he had been wrong years ago. He did not dramatize the admission. He did not attempt to excuse it. He simply stated it. The words rested between them without demand. Emily regarded him for a measured moment. She did not search his face for regret. She did not reopen old narratives. She acknowledged the statement with a nod and replied that growth often arrives when pride leaves. The sentence was calm, not sharp. He seemed to accept it. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door and said he hoped someday to earn her trust beyond contracts. She answered that trust, like investment returns, required consistency over time. The elevator doors closed, and this time she did not watch the numbers descend. She returned to her desk and continued working, the rhythm of her day uninterrupted. That evening she met Jonathan by the river, snow gathering lightly along the walkway. He asked if she felt resolved. She considered the question carefully. Resolution, she realized, was not an event. It was a posture. She told him she felt balanced. They walked side by side beneath the city lights, breath visible in the cold air, footsteps aligned. Days later she received the first scheduled repayment transfer, the amount precise to the cent. She reviewed it without celebration and filed the confirmation into a digital folder labeled accordingly. There would be no dramatic reunion at a holiday table, no theatrical confrontation beneath blinking lights. Instead, there was distance maintained through respect, boundaries reinforced through policy, and a future no longer defined by a single December night. On Christmas Eve she stood on her balcony overlooking the river, the skyline reflecting silver against dark water. Inside her apartment a modest tree glowed softly, ornaments simple and intentional. She held a mug of tea in both hands and allowed herself a quiet reflection. The girl who once left with a single suitcase had not returned to reclaim a house. She had built her own foundation. The man who once measured control through volume now operated within the parameters she set. She did not need to remind him of it. The evidence existed in contracts, in scheduled payments, in the absence of raised voices. As church bells echoed faintly across the city at midnight, Emily understood that victory had never required revenge. It required composure. She did not win by overpowering him. She won by outgrowing the room where she had once been made to feel small. And as the lights shimmered against the winter sky, she stood steady in the knowledge that dignity does not shout. It endures.